Welcome to another episode of the SNA Speakeasy. Today we are talking to someone who is all the way across the world in the state of Texas. His name is Hiroki Takeuchi, and he's an associate professor at Southern Methodist University in Texas, Dallas area. And he is going to talk to us today about trade policy in Asia, and this, in particular, Japan's role in it. So thank you, Professor Takeuchi, for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to have you here. Yeah, first of all, some people may know you and be familiar with your work, and others may not. So, first of all, can you kind of introduce yourself? So, who are you? How did you end up in Texas? And what is it that you focus your studies on?
I'm Hiroki Takeuchi. I'm an associate professor of political science at Southern Methodist University, SMU, in Dallas, Texas. And I came to Dallas when SMU invited me to a job interview, and then I got a job here. I'm currently directing a Sunstar program on Japan and East Asia in the SMU Tower Center. SMU Tower Center is a policy center in SMU. And the Sunstar program on Japan and East Asia is the East Asia program that focuses on the whole East Asia, but actually that focuses on Japan. So actually, a Sunstar program is, as long as I know, the only East Asia program in the nation that has Japan before East Asia. Um, I actually grew up in Japan, and then I came to United States for graduate school. And then I was in California for 12 years before coming to Texas. In now, I lived in California for about 12 years, and then now I live in Texas for 13 years. So I live in Texas longer than California. I'm enjoying living in Dallas and then teaching at SMU.
Mm-hmm.
I was trained as a China specialist, and although I'm originally from Japan, so my first book is about local governance in rural China. So I did a lot of interviews in Chinese countryside, and then I published a book in 2014. And then for last few years, I changed my scope to a more international political economy. So I'm currently working on the topic of the relationship between trade and peace, or trade and security. But I still doing a lot of research on China, but as well as Japan and the United States. Um, well, it was interesting. Many people are interested in China, I know. Because I studied Chinese domestic politics and economics when I was doing the graduate school and then to write my first book, um, I actually know that Chinese foreign policy is kind of inside out. So Chinese foreign policy is based on its domestic politics. And because I was working on local government before working on international political economy. So that's actually how I see foreign policy making and international relations.
Okay, excellent. I certainly agree that to an extreme degree, the country's internal politics do shape their foreign policy. We saw that very dramatically, I think, during the Trump administration recently, didn't we?
Yeah.
All right. Well, today our topic title is Japan at the Center of Trade Rulemaking in the Asia Pacific. Well, I think most people are going to understand what all of those terms mean, but if there's any question, it would be over trade rulemaking. So, what exactly is trade rulemaking, and why is it significant?
So trade rulemaking is international rulemaking. So nations negotiate and make rules over international trade. For a long time after World War II, GATT was playing that role, and then GATT became World Trade Organization (WTO) in 1995. So it's called a multilateral organization. And so that kind of the big organization that consists of like many nations all over the world are making the rules of trade. And international trade skyrocketed uh, after World War II, and then mainly because of those like rule makings at GATT and WTO. And then now, but no, for last 2 decades, WTO is not functioning well to make new rules. At the same time, the nature of trade has changed for last 2 decades. So we need a new rulemaking. And then, so as a result, we have more and more like regional trade agreements. And so like one of them is typically like a Trans-Pacific Partnership, or now called CPTPP. And then those like regional trade agreements are now making new rules of international trade, while trade's nature has been changing. And then now we are like in the age of new globalization. So that's actually that's how rulemaking is. Rulemaking of trade is. Yeah.
Well, before we get to this, you mentioned something interesting there, which I think is important to set the background. Why has the World Trade Organization, WTO, stalled as the main forum for international trade making now?
Well, actually, I think there's three reasons. One reason is it is actually because of the victim of the success. That is, WTO has been successful in expanding the scope and then also expanding the membership. So, so many now, like more than 160 countries are a member of the WTO, and then that includes a lot of developing countries. And the developed countries and developing countries have different preferences, and different interests. And then it's more and more difficult to adjust the interests difference of interests among the between the developed countries and developing countries. At the same time, actually, GATT was very successful for 30 or 40 years after World War II in lowering tariffs. And lowering tariffs is actually a relatively easy task because that's actually all number, right? So when you negotiate, you just talk about number and then exchanging the conditions of the numbers. But that's actually now tariffs are very low in international trade. So now they have to negotiate over more sensitive issues. And then more and more, a lot of the sensitive issues, new issues are related to domestic regulation. So now trade negotiation discusses a lot about how to standardize the domestic regulations. And once that they talk about domestic regulations, it's all very sensitive in domestic politics. So as a result, it's very difficult for each nation to have a consensus in domestic politics. And then as a result, that makes the international negotiation much more difficult. Another reason is actually the kind of United States is less and less enthusiastic about trade liberalization. So one reason is mainly because in domestic politics, United States is getting more and more protectionist. And then the United States is receiving protectionist pressure from domestic politics, especially labor unions and also environmental groups. So I think one reason is the United States was leading the trade liberalization for a long time in GATT and WTO, but for the last 2 decades, United States finds it difficult, more difficult to lead trade liberalization. That's actually another reason why WTO is dysfunctioning as a rulemaking organization.
Mm. Um, Well, again, a kind of a basic question, but one which could set the stage for our conversation here is why does it matter who sets the rules of trade? I mean, if every country has to agree to whatever whatever regime exists, does it make a difference who takes the lead on designing those rules?
Yes. First of all, whether there are rules matters. So well, economists often say like more trade the better, and then if like the nation open the economy, that will be good for its own economy. But the puzzle is why like then most of the nations have some kind of restrictions on trade at any time. So that's actually interesting. But key is there are two keys. One is so even if like every country appreciates trade liberalization, how to do it is a question, right? So if if the country has a little bit of protectionism, then like it's considered as protectionist policy. What is considered as trade liberalization? What is considered as a commitment to the promise of trade liberalization? So that's actually a very so you need to make a specific rule to set the norm of trade liberalization. Second reason is you have to convince the domestic audience to open the economy, because trade actually actually benefits every country as an aggregate, but trade actually creates some winners and losers. The winners' interest is actually always bigger than the losers' losses. However, but there are losers, right? So those who lose from trade needs a compensation, or at least in some way the government has to convince those who would lose from trade. So that's actually, in that sense, if you have a specific rules at the international level, then it's much easier for the government to convince the losers of trade. So for those two reasons, actually, both internationally and domestically, making trade rules at the international level is very important.
Okay. Well, let's turn to Japan. I think that Japan's reputation in the post-war period has been as one of the sort of holdouts on trade liberalization in the sense of importing products to its own market. Japan's agricultural sector in particular is known to be quite resistant to allowing agricultural products from other countries. The giant keiretsu and zaibatsu, or I guess keiretsu out in the post-war period, were kind of well known for non-tariff barriers. This was something that the trade representative of the United States in the earlier eras used to clash with Japan about. So how is it that in the late part of the last decade, during the Abe administration, Japan is now presenting itself as sort of the champion of free trade?
Yeah, actually, that's very surprising. As you say, you're right. So Japan was famous, or if not notorious, for just following the U.S. lead, and then very reluctantly opening the economy, confronting the pressure from the United States. That was Japan until, let's say, 2 decades ago. There are, I think, two reasons why Japan has become leader from the follower. So the one reason is United States has become kind of tacitly withdrawing from the leadership role. So if United States doesn't lead, who can lead? And China is the second largest economy, but China has a huge state sector, and then that's actually makes China more difficult to be committed to trade liberalization. So then who is the third largest economy? So Japan, and then also the fourth largest economy, Germany. So now Japan and Germany are the leaders of trade liberalization, or even a more larger sense, rulemaking of so-called international liberal order. So that's actually that's one reason. That's an international reason. The other reason is a domestic. So the Japanese domestic politics. So in the 1990s, especially under Hashimoto administration, a lot of administrative and political reform was advanced. One of them is electoral reform in 1994, but then other reforms, like in terms of the relationship between the prime minister's house, so-called kante, and bureaucracy. So used to be those bureaucrats, like especially as your example of agricultural products, like the Ministry of Agriculture is colluding with so-called Norinzoku of the LDP. That's actually agricultural tribe in the LDP. They are colluding and then try to block every trade liberalization measures. So that was actually the Japanese politics until the 1990s. But as a result of administrative reform, now Kante, Prime Minister office, is much more powerful compared with the bureaucracy of the government, so-called Kasumigaseki in Japan. I think that one reason now Japanese Prime Minister, Japan can lead trade negotiation in the international sphere is the Prime Minister and the cabinet is much more powerful over those who have vested interests based on the collusion between the tribe politicians and the bureaucrats. That's actually another reason. So, well, one example is so Japan led the Trans-Pacific Partnership, well, joined the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then Japan led the CPTPP negotiation after U.S. withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If that occurred 3 decades ago, before 1990s, then agricultural Ministry of Agriculture officials will take it as a good opportunity to resist trade liberalization, and then probably a prime minister cannot convince officials and LDP politicians, and then Japan would have no way to lead the international negotiation of the trade agreement.
Mm. Well, I think there are probably some who would argue that while what you described there is very much what happened, it's not necessarily a positive development from some perspectives. They would say, well, look, what has also increased during this period is sort of neoliberal economics, where essentially the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and those who used to have more power at the bottom parts of the political structure have lost that power. And that societies and economic systems have become more authoritarian. Do you feel that this is a legitimate criticism, or do you think that the benefits of trade in terms of bringing more consumer choice and other positive aspects outweigh this more top-down approach to policymaking?
Actually, I think overall trade has had a positive impact on increasing the economic welfare of the nation. And then it's true that inequality has expanded all over the world, actually, especially in the developed countries, more in the United States than in Japan, actually. But that actually mainly comes from automation, not globalization, actually. So globalization has some impact, but at the same time, much more impact comes from automation. And then, so automation is not a human's choice, right? So, so automation has occurred because of the technology progress, and nobody can stop technology's progress, right? So, so when automation occurs, how should we respond? And then one way to respond is increasing the trade liberalization, and then try to make a globalization, try to use globalization as a cushion for the impact of automation. And then key is actually social welfare policy. So try to upgrade social safety net is necessary. And then United States has not been successful in upgrading social safety net, and that's why inequality has expanded, and then so-called populist backlash to globalization has occurred. So Japan is better, but at the same time, Japan also faces the same problem. So that's actually the very important point. So overall, to me, the criticism against globalization for expansion of inequality is not so fair because it doesn't consider the impact of automation.
Okay. Just to stay one more question with the Japan domestic situation, if we're going to talk about the, expanding and strengthening the social welfare net or other things that provide income to lower income people and middle class even. One of the big arguments in Japan and elsewhere, but especially in Japan, I think, is that the aging of the population means, and the shrinking of the workforce means that this country, which is already, I think, in percentage terms, the most indebted country in the world, although it's owned mostly domestically, not internationally, essentially states can't afford it. So so how does that kind of clash with this idea that if automation is driving this inequality as you see it, and there's too much debt and there's shrinking workforce and all of these other problems, how is the social safety net going to keep pace with that?
So I think it's most important thing is how to create wealth, right? So social safety net or social welfare policy, that is basically redistribution policy. And in order to redistribute, you have to create the wealth first. So who will create the wealth is the question. And then so one is usually the population is the basis of the creation of wealth. So each person works, and then wealth is created. So that number is shrinking, as you said, because population is shrinking, especially young people's population is shrinking. Right. So that's why the discussion of immigration is coming in, right? So Japanese government deliberately does not call it immigration, but foreign workers. But actually, economically, same thing, and politically different, but economically, same thing. So I think to me, if you take the position of how to create wealth and who to create wealth, that will straighten up the debate of immigration, and then hopefully, Japan will go to the direction to discuss how to manage immigration, given that an increase of immigrants is necessary. And then that would be good for economy. And then if Japan can manage it, then that would be good for society and also good for everybody. So that's actually one key. And then finally, I think that immigration has become the kind of one of the important issues in Japan. So that's actually for next 5 to 10 years. That discussion of immigration will increase.
Okay, well, let's move more towards the international aspects then. To what extent, I mean, most of the stuff about Japan really embracing free trade came about during the course of the Abe administration, Shinzo Abe. And Shinzo Abe, to a large extent, he's not an economist. He's somebody who basically comes out of the right-wing nationalist tradition of Japanese politics. There's really no doubt about that. But for him, it seemed like a lot of his free trade policy was really kind of about soft containment of China. It was really driven by, his ideology that he wanted Japan to take a lead in the region in order to have a stronger position via the Chinese. So to what extent do you think that was the driving force behind Abe's policy of sort of the free and open Indo-Pacific, as he called it? And to what extent do you think that that impacts the region itself.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. So overall, I think China was behind every issue. So but so the question is how. So there's no question that China is important, and how to manage the relationship with China, that is important for any country, including the United States. And so well, Abe is an interesting. Abe is an interesting person, and more so is Abe administration was very interesting. So Abe came as as you said, nationalist politician, but then his legacy is quite internationalist. So nobody imagined that he would make he would conclude the big free trade agreement during his term, nobody would have imagined when he came into office, even the second time in 2012. I think that the one thing is Abe learned from the first term. He learned that in order to stay in office, he should be away from his original agenda of nationalism, but he should turn to more internationalism. And then that's actually the key for him to stay in office. And then he thought, staying in office would be more important than pushing his original nationalist agenda, amending the constitution. So that's actually his priority in his second term. And then that's actually source of his success. China, how to manage China or relationship with China is very important for Japan. It's even more important for Japan than for the United States. Because one, Japan is very close to China geographically, so security concern is more imminent. And secondly, Japanese economy is more Japan is more interdependent with China than United States is. So economic relationship with China is even more important for Japan than for the United States. So the managing the both security and economic relationship with China is crucially important for Japanese leader. And then when Abe came in, when Abe came back to office in his second term in 2012, I think what he had in mind is one. He actually realized the sort of threat of China. So as many of the hawks realized. But at the same time, he also thought of the importance of economic relationship with China. So you cannot take a purely hawkish policy toward China. And then in that sense, concluding the mega free trade agreement like Trans-Pacific Partnership was the ideal solution to solve both problems. So it was that he found a TPP as kind of one stone, killing two birds with one stone.
The TPP is a very interesting case, especially where we are today. I was covering the news here directly during the time of the Hatoyama administration. And of course, he had his vision, which was quite new and different, of the East Asian community, which he was pushing during his short administration. And this extremely alarmed Washington and basically all of the Japanese bilateralists who looked to Washington for their policy. They thought, oh my goodness, to create a Japan, South Korea, China economic and political bloc was like their worst nightmare. And I could see that the idea which they were pushing, especially after Hatoyama fell and Naoto Kan became prime minister, was TPP. They saw it as sort of the anti-East Asian community policy because its focal point was Japan-U.S. relations, and China wasn't part of that bloc. But where we stand today is that with Trump coming into office in 2017, the United States withdrew from the TPP, and now it became the CPTPP without the United States, and it's probably going to be difficult for the Biden administration to rejoin that for U.S. domestic reasons. And at the same time, we have other countries now asking to join. The first official asker is the United Kingdom in across the world because of their own Brexit issues.
Mm.
But another country which is thinking about asking is China, which is the greatest of all ironies because, if you accept my analysis that TPP was originally pushed as sort of the anti-China riposte to the East Asian community, then having China join the TPP while the United States remains out is extremely ironic. So how do you see this idea of China being part of the CPTPP?
So, looking at the U.S. Traditional China policy, there are two policies. One is called containment, the other is called engagement. And then a similar thing can be said for Japanese China policy. And TPP is actually serving for both, right? Containing China and engaging China. When Prime Minister Khan proposed the interest in joining the TPP negotiation, so he actually just talked about containing China. And then when the Abe administration officially joined the TPP negotiation, basically Japan started taking like a TPP to be good for both containing and engaging China. So that's why. So China excluded from TPP membership is serving for containing China, but at the same time, if China is included, or at least like giving China an incentive to join the TPP, whether it is possible or not, is serving for the purpose of engaging China. That's actually an interesting situation right now. The reason that the U.S. is out of TPP and China has been out of TPP are very different, right? Those two reasons are not actually related to each other, at least from the economic perspective. So the United States cannot be committed to any trade agreement right now because of the skepticism coming from domestic politics. Although actually Texas is actually almost completely for Trans-Pacific Partnership, but so-called the Rust Belt, the Midwest, is quite skeptical. So as a result, Washington overall is quite skeptical about the feasibility of joining TPP. Well, China's problem of joining the TPP is whether China can satisfy the conditions of state-owned enterprise reform. So nowadays, free trade agreements like TPP, typically TPP, requires the signatories to be committed to a lot of domestic economic reforms. And China, of course, doesn't want to be kind of preached that what you should do this, you should do that. And then also there is a huge resistance from the vested interests, those who have vested interests in the state-owned enterprise system. So basically, China's state capitalist system is based on the benefits, vested interests of the state-owned enterprises. So a lot of jobs are related to that. A lot of the political interests are also embedded. So that's why China finds it difficult to be to join the TPP. At the same time, that will serve for China's economic interests. So if China joins, or China at least tries to join the TPP, then they may have a strong incentive to be committed to economic reform. So in China, there are two groups: those who are so-called reformists, those who are arguing for advancing more economic reforms. They want China to join the TPP. In that way, they are empowered for advancing the reform. But at the same time, those who are against reforms, those who lose the vested interests in state-owned enterprise system, they oppose the TPP, and then because that's actually it will undermine their vested interests. So China has actually two voices, both the reformists and versus anti-reformists, and then they are saying they are actually fighting against each other in the Chinese domestic politics. And then, but we hear both voices. So that's actually interesting.
Okay, and there's one other major trade pact that I think we can't ignore, and that's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. So, what is its significance, and is it have any dynamics that are different from TPP?
So RCEP is actually the free trade agreement of ASEAN with originally six countries: Japan, South Korea, China, Australia, New Zealand, and India. And in the last minute, India withdrew from the negotiation. So now it's actually ASEAN plus five. It's significant for a few reasons. One, that's the first mega free trade agreement, including all of China, South Korea, Japan. And then, secondly, it actually lowered tariff levels significantly. So even though tariffs of the developed countries have been very low, tariffs of developing countries were still high. So it lowered the tariffs of the developing countries. So that's actually significant. However, there is a limitation. So that is one is it's because China is a member, and so basically there is no agreement of no commitment. No requirement for the commitment to domestic economic reforms. So we cannot expect China to be committed to state-owned enterprise reform just with RCEP. So good news is actually RCEP and the TPP are not contradictory with each other. So that could be they could be a complementary, and then so it's actually overall a good thing that China. Both China and Japan led the conclusion of the RCEP.
Okay, and before we move to the patron Q&A, is there any other point about Japan and rulemaking for trade in the Asia Pacific that you'd like to touch on in the open part of this talk?
I think one thing is I hope that Japanese people will realize how much the world, especially the United States, hopes Japan to lead the international trade negotiation. Because now United States is kind of restrained by domestic politics for the ability to lead international trade negotiation. And then United States, of course, does not want China to lead the international trade negotiations. So really, expectation to Japan is very high, especially in the sphere of international trade. So that's actually many Americans who are engaged in policy making realize it or know it, but I'm not sure how much Japanese people, especially even those who are engaged in policy making, do realize it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And now we do move to our patron Q&A section.